In this episode, we venture deep below Yharnam into the land of the ancient Pthumerians, known as the Chalice Dungeons. What's up everyone, I'm Ghost Riposte and the host of these rankings. I know this week was supposed to be the Sekiro boss rankings, but I just played through the Chalice Dungeons and had the footage, so it made more sense to make this video while the gameplay was fresh in my head. No worries though, my samurai friends, the Sekiro rankings will be coming next. On a quick side note, many of your comments, and even some of my own, are randomly being removed from my videos. So if you left me a message and I didn't respond, I'm so sorry. I'm not ignoring you, I just never saw your comment. I checked all of the settings and even filed a support request with YouTube, but never heard back. Unfortunately, there's nothing I could really do about this, so hopefully it's temporary, and in the meantime, I'm just gonna keep making the best videos that I can make. That aside, this week we're veering slightly away from our usual ranking structure based on boss aesthetic, story, lore, soundtrack, and arena. The reason being is many of the bosses use repeat soundtracks, don't have a ton of lore to them, and some are just straight up main game enemies with a boss health bar. In addition, we will be keeping repeat bosses as a single entry, basing their slot in the list on the best version of them that appears. No need to have this little bastard ranked twice. Due to many of the Chalice Dungeon bosses not having a lot of context to them, this is going to be the one time the rankings are a little more off the cuff, but next week the Sekiro rankings will return to the standard structure. I thought about simply making this video a difficulty rankings, but decided to stick to design discussion for the time being. One last note, I'm thinking about streaming at some point tomorrow, as I'd like to start doing that every once in a while, so if there's anything in particular you guys want me to play, let me know below. I like all kinds of Souls games, so I'm open to any ideas. Anyways, I hope everyone enjoys the rankings, as that's why I make these videos. Let's get into the list. Loran Silverbeast, Lower Loran. Given the hints of electric current flowing through the Lower Loran Chalice Dungeon and the lightning theme, it makes sense that Loran Silverbeast would be found here. Unfortunately, he's a pretty basic in-game enemy that doesn't make for a particularly interesting boss fight. A version of this creature is originally found in the Nightmare Frontier and Nightmare of Mensis. He does have two phases, one standing and one on all fours, but neither do anything particularly out of the ordinary. Despite carrying a torch in phase 1, it is actually weak to fire. I do like his multi-layer arena, but definitely one of the least memorable boss entries in the Chalice Dungeons. Maneater Boar, Hintertomb. When facing this oversized pig, I had totally forgotten that he had a backward donkey kick in the Chalice Dungeons, which was pretty funny the first time, and combined with how much more rambunctious he is in here, he definitely made me sweat a little more than I thought I would have to. That being said, there's really not much to him, as he's simply an oversized pig as a result of the beast plague and just a standard enemy with a health bar. Brain Sucker, Lower Hintertomb and Great Is. On a quick side note, I threw out a question to the Bloodborne Reddit asking how to pronounce I-S-Z, as in Great Is, and got more answers than I was even aware of. I got is, I got eyes, I got ish, I got eats, I got all kinds of answers, so I'm just gonna stick with is for now. I thank anyone who answered, but that's what I'm gonna go with this time around. Anyways, this little guy is probably the bane of many players' existence. Brain Sucker has got to be one of the most irritating enemies in the main game, as this little bastard can siphon insight right out of your brain, hence the name. This little Cthulhu-like creature is thought to perhaps suck brains for insight, as they are trying to ascend to become great ones and are perhaps worshippers of Odin, as they have hollow eyes, and the word Oedipism is the self-removal of your eyes. I can't confirm this factually in-game, but creepy stuff either way. I doubt either encounter with him will bring particularly joy to your life. Merciless Watcher and Chieftain, Pthumeru and Lower Pthumeru. I enjoy the fun in pairing these three goofs walking around the arena, but I doubt either encounter is going to be anyone's favorite fight. They aren't particularly unique, as versions of them appear countless times in the dungeons. As mentioned with the Loran Silverbeast entry, I'd actually love to see something done in the future with the first encounter's arena, as I love the multi-floor layout. I know it might not stand out as the room is used multiple times in the dungeons, but with the right boss, I think this would make for a really unique and fun arena. The combat can be fun deciding how to pick each member of this gank squad off, but the difficulty is scaled so low, it might not be the most engaging for a lot of players. Celestial Emissary. Great is. Or eyes, or eats. I'm still not entirely sure. But anyway, Celestial Emissary, specifically the Chalice Dungeon version, is a missed opportunity for me. He has a unique concept and design, which could have allowed for an interesting fight. The fact that he can produce arcane spells in his second phase really opens up the door for some fun and varied attack patterns. However, he really only has a few attacks, mostly revolving around trying to stomp on you, and a version of Call Beyond that is fairly easy to dodge. It makes sense the Celestial Emissary is located here in proximity to Ebrietas as in the main game, as it fits the narrative of the choir, reaching audience with Ebrietas via the Great Is Chalice. Beast-Possessed Soul, central to Meru and ailing Loran. This is a main game enemy that I'm actually pretty happy FromSoftware included in the Chalice dungeons, as he only appears once in the base game, doesn't respawn, and is pretty easy to miss on a first playthrough. Beast-Possessed Soul uses a range of fire attacks, which are actually pretty cool. He isn't particularly aggressive though, and you should be able to dodge his fire and parry him reliably, with some practice. The Beast rune dropped by his base game version reads, "A transcription of the roar of a labyrinth beast. The bearer of the Beast rune has accentuated transformation effects." Beast is one of the early Carol runes, as well as one of the first to be deemed forbidden. The discovery of blood entailed the discovery of undesirable beasts. This gameplay and lore, along with his unique ram-like horns and design, make him a welcome addition to the Chalice dungeons. Undead Giant, Pthumeru, Lower Pthumeru, and Hintertomb. Undead Giant is your introduction to Chalice dungeon bosses, and you'll duel him across 3 variations throughout your journey. He's basically playing a horrified version of Edward 40 Hands, as the first time he has a curved sword strapped to each arm, the second time a hook and giant club, and the third time, depending on your order, an axe and cannon. The fights each function in a similar fashion as they lumber around while you steer clear of their heavy attacks, although the curved sword variant does have a surprising leaping attack. These undead giants hold similar facial features to the church giants and the church servants found around the cathedral ward and a couple of other locations. It's thought that the Healing Church may have enslaved these giants, as they probably didn't strap these weapons to themselves and place candles on their own backs. I couldn't find a hard item confirmation of this, but it seems to be a connect the dots theory. Forgotten Madman, Lower Hintertomb. Another Chalice Dungeon exclusive boss. I actually look forward to this fight. A former member of the Healing Church, he wields Ludwig's rifle and Holy Blade, which I think is imbued by the empty Phantasm shell. He can call upon Augur of Ebrietas, and I believe even a Call Beyond, although he didn't use it here. Madman's escort does appear halfway through the fight, and given that neither of them does huge damage and the cover available in the room, I thought it would make more sense for them to both be present for the length of the fight, especially given the escort's minimal health. Upon defeat, you can actually purchase the Forgotten Madman set via insight from the Bath Messengers. The attire states, most tomb prospectors, members of the Healing Church chosen to explore the old labyrinth, are unable to withstand the weight of old knowledge and go mad. This attire is worn by those lost souls. Truth oft resembles madness, inaccessible to the dull of mind. Those who go mad are merely thoughtful souls who failed to reach any conclusions. Blood-Starved Beast, Hintertomb and Ailing Loran. The inclusion of Blood-Starved Beast twice in the Chalice dungeons is a bit of a disappointment for me, especially since you already come across him as a boss in the main game and a stray enemy in the DLC. It's not that he's a bad boss, it just feels repetitive after a while, which has always been a common theme in discussing the Chalice dungeons. From what I gather, the Chalice dungeons were an interesting concept that Miyazaki and the team never had the time to fully flesh out and develop. I still enjoy running them now and then, but I can't say I enjoy them as much as the main game. There isn't a ton to say here that I didn't mention in the main game rankings, but it of course should be noted that the Pthumerian Chalice is awarded upon defeat of the blood-starved beast in the Church of the Good Chalice, so it makes perfect sense that it would appear on a couple of occasions in the Chalice dungeons. Keeper of the Old Lords, Central Pthumerian, and Cursed Pthumerian Defilement. I've always found the Keeper of the Old Lords Bone Ash set to be one of the coolest NPC armor sets in Bloodborne, and its fire-resistant properties come in handy against bosses like Loran, for example. After you defeat the Keeper, its armor set will become available via the Insight Bath in the Hunter's Dream. It reads, "A mask made of bone ash, worn by the oldest Keepers. The Keepers who mined the slumbering Great Ones gained eternal life preserved in ashen form in a ceremony of flame, the cremated body and soul. The long pointed hat is a symbol of old Keepers and is considered evidence of their companionship forged in a certain sin." The combination of he or she's, I couldn't find a definitive answer. Flame attacks along with sword work make for a fairly fun fight, although I would have liked the sword attacks to perhaps have some more variation to them. Overall, a pretty cool Chalice dungeon encounter. Rom the Vacuous Spider, Lower Pthumerian. It was difficult to try to mesh the main game bosses into the list with the Chalice dungeon bosses. I thought about making this a list of bosses exclusive to the Chalice dungeons, but the main game bosses are probably included in the main Chalice dungeons for a reason, so who am I to question Miyazaki? Rom is always difficult to gauge, as many of you probably enjoy the lore and role in the main game that she plays, but a number of you probably detest the fight itself, especially when it's in a cramped Chalice dungeon tomb and not a massive endless lake. I usually play the fight slow and steady, taking out each spider minion before going to town on Rom once it's open season. I didn't have too tough of a time in this run, as both Rom and her minions are annihilated by arcane damage. I would imagine at the very least, if you didn't know Rom was down here, you must have had a WTF moment, as she's the last boss you'd expect to be in the Chalice dungeons, given how different they are from her arena. Bloodletting Beast, Lower Pthumerian and Great Pthumerian. In adventuring through the Chalice dungeons, you'll come across two versions of the Bloodletting Beast, one of which will definitely stick out for you Sekiro players. That of course being the Great Pthumerian Ihil version, which strikes similarities to the Guardian Ape's second phase as well as the True Monk's third phase. He has ape-like features and movements and really feels like a precursor to Guardian Ape, so I would imagine FromSoftware had some level of inspiration from this fight. His first encounter isn't too bad outside of a thrusting attack that comes on quicker than you would think. The camera can be a little tough, but that's hard to implement with the sheer size difference between the player and the beast. The second fight has some interesting twists, as the Bloodletting Beast has a rapid poison attack, not dramatically far off in function to the True Monk's terror attack, especially when combined in Phase 2 with the nasty massive parasite larva that honestly sends chills down my spine every time. That thing is just nasty to me. Once again, this fight surely held some influence on later FromSoftware designs and is a nice inclusion in the Chalice dungeons. Yharnam, Pthumerian Queen, Great Pthumerian. The namesake of Bloodborne's host city, Yharnam herself is actually one of my favorite fights in the Chalice dungeons, mostly due to how unique it is. I think people would enjoy the fight a little more if her stats or aggressiveness were scaled a little bit more for endgame, as many find her anticlimactic. I think by the time most of us get to Yharnam in this Chalice dungeon, you're pretty well leveled up to get away with quite a few mistakes in her fight. This leniency takes a lot of the tension out of the air of the arena. You could avoid leveling for a challenge, but most first-time dungeon crawlers are gonna level up their stats as they gain blood echoes. Also, I wasn't sure if you could parry and riposte Yharnam or not, so when I was able to, I couldn't decide if it was disturbing or hilarious. Yharnam's attacks are not necessarily hard-hitting, although she has quite a varied moveset and an enormous health pool. She can inflict you with rapid poisoning, launch you up into the air, clone herself, hack away with slashing, and even Mergo's cries can briefly entrap you. One interesting note is you have noticed she actually shares a theme song with Martyr Logarius. Victory yields you the Yharnam Stone, which reads, "A sacred heirloom left by Yharnam, Pthumerian Queen. The queen lies dead, but her horrific consciousness is only asleep and stirs in unsettling motions." Pthumerian Descendant, Central Pthumeru, and Great Pthumeru. The version of this guy that appears in Great Pthumeru is an absolute unit. I probably would have struggled more with this beast of a man had I not been significantly leveled up by this point in the dungeons. The fight seems to be identical, except the latter version's damage and health is scaled up quite a bit. I don't think he's necessarily more aggressive in the second fight, but it's the tight quarters of the room in contrast with the open area in the first encounter that make him feel more overbearing. His parry timing can be tricky, but it's definitely a huge help in defeating this monster of a man. The second phase he enters, wielding double shodels, will probably remind some of you of Lautrec in Dark Souls, as he employs the same loadout. The Pthumerian Descendant is one of the last servers of the noble line of Pthumerians that carved out the ancient labyrinths. Abhorrent Beast, Ailing Loran and Lower Loran. Everyone's favorite cannibal NPC, originally found eating a woman's remains on a rooftop in the Forbidden Woods. I've always struggled with this boss in a similar way to Flame Lurker in Demon's Souls. The short, varied windups have always been very difficult to read and dodge for me, although I do enjoy the fight overall and have always loved his electrified beast design. Given the striking similarities in type, perhaps Abhorrent Beasts evolve into Darkbeasts, but that could just be my nostalgic love for Pokemon talking. On a factual note, the suspicious beggar NPC that transforms into the in-game Abhorrent Beast wears Madman leggings, suggesting he probably did delve into the Chalice dungeons at some point. Amygdala, Cursed Pthumerian Defilement. I bumped up Amygdala on this list as some of you gave great points about her on my Bloodborne main game boss rankings. If you thought the Nightmare Frontier version of Amygdala was difficult, try fighting her with half health in the Cursed and Defiled dungeon and a room with minimal space around the outside to operate. Her moveset isn't tremendously difficult to learn, as the main idea is to get in and out and deal damage to her head, but there is very little room for mistakes, as a couple of strikes are likely to take you out. You could also take cover close underneath Amygdala in her blind spots, but you'll deal significantly less damage to her sturdy legs. Being a great one, Amygdala obviously holds significant weight lore-wise in Bloodborne, and can be seen in various locations around the game. Fighting her at half health will surely put all of your combat skills to the test. Pthumerian Elder, Lower Hintertomb. Pthumerian Elder is certainly one of the best Chalice dungeon exclusive bosses. The mechanic of his staff being able to morph into different weapons, including a lance, crossbow, scythe, and mace, is a really cool idea. I don't know if this is verified anywhere in-game, but the Bloodborne fandom page mentions his transforming weapon could be considered a Pthumerian version of a trick weapon, suggesting Gehrman was not the first to invent this type of weapon. Although his weapon seems to transform in a much more arcane or magical fashion as opposed to the mechanical nature of the weapons obtained in the main game. Pthumerian Elder isn't a particularly aggressive boss, but the large array of attacks he uses can be pretty tricky to read and time. It actually took me a few tries to get the best of him. This varied combat that keeps you on your toes is some of my favorite in the dungeons, and Bloodborne in general, to be honest. I've always liked the aesthetic of the Pthumerians as well, as their hulking stature and being is quite intimidating on a first playthrough. Overall, certainly one of the best Chalice Dungeon bosses, if nothing else for the creativity of his moveset. Watchdog of the Old Lords, Pthumeru and Cursed Pthumerian Defilement. Watchdog of the Old Lords is one of my personal favorite bosses in the game. I mean, look at him, a giant dog that breathes fire. How cool does he look? He's also one of the most difficult bosses in the Chalice dungeons, in part due to your health being cut in half. Depending on your leveling, you can really only sustain a couple of hits, and he can even one-shot you entirely. This was actually my first attempt. Feel free to laugh at my demise. I laughed at myself when this happened. As you can see in the footage, I made a handful of attempts with the Holy Moonlight Sword, and when I realized that was going to take longer than my patience allowed that day, I caved and swapped over to everyone's favorite pizza cutter, which I did not feel even the least bit sorry about using. Watchdog's moveset isn't tremendously difficult to learn, as most of you probably took out his first variation without too much trouble, but his defiled version deals heavy damage, seems to be more aggressive, and oh yeah, you fight with your health cut in half. All in all, Watchdog is a fantastic addition to the Chalice dungeons and is surely one of the best bosses exclusive to them. Ebrietas, Daughter of the Cosmos, Great Is. Ebrietas is one of my favorite bosses in the main game, having placed 5th overall in those rankings. As I mentioned in the introduction, I had trouble deciding whether to just omit main game bosses from this list, but ended up keeping them in as they are part of the main dungeons. Adding to the fact, Ebrietas has huge lore implications to the Chalice dungeons, as the Great Is Chalice description reads, Great Chalices unlock deeper reaches of the labyrinth. The Great Is Chalice became the cornerstone of the choir, the elite delegation of the Healing Church. It was also the first Great Chalice brought back to the surface since the time of Bergenworth, and allowed the choir to have audience with Ebrietas. In making this list, I actually wondered, are Great Ones actually entire species, and that's why there are versions in the Chalice dungeons? Or are these the same Great Ones existing on another plane in a different time? Are the Chalice dungeons simply elaborate resting places created by the Pthumerians specifically for the Great Ones? Did the Pthumerians and the choir of the Healing Church have any interactions? Just have so many questions. Give me your theories below. Anyways, while Ebrietas is one of the best bosses in the main game, I do have to say her arena lets her down a bit here. I find her main game arena, especially the purple colors, to complement her and the fight much more nicely. Her design, however, still perfectly encapsulates an eldritch-like monstrosity, and her combat is balanced nicely for a creature of this size. Although a main game repeat, the lore connection makes her a welcome addition to the Chalice dungeons. Loran Darkbeast, Lower Loran. Having not run the Chalice dungeons for a decent amount of time, I had forgotten what a nightmare this electrifying beast was. I thought I was going to march into his arena, laugh in his face, and chop out one leg at a time, just as with Darkbeast Parl. I was quickly reminded this was Parl, but with every aspect scaled to 10. I have to say, Loran Darkbeast and Defiled Watchdog were my two biggest hurdles in completing this run. This guy hits like a truck, is extremely aggressive, and has a fairly large health pool. While it's somewhat personal taste, his giant electrical frame is surely one of the coolest designs in the game. Combat-wise, if you choose to handle this fight locked on, the camera can be an absolute nightmare as his head can be very difficult to hit. Repeated attacks on his legs can still make him crumble to the ground. His Chalice dungeon version could just sustain substantially more damage. It's interesting how balancing and scaling difficulty can change how you look at a fight. I never ranked Darkbeast Parl as one of the best bosses in Bloodborne, perhaps because once you learn how to fight him, he's quite a pushover. However, his dungeon version being much more difficult feels much more rewarding upon victory. While a little less structured than my normal rankings, I hope everyone enjoyed this week's entry of the Chalice Dungeon bosses. As I said, next up we venture to Ashina and the land of the samurai, where we will be counting down the best bosses in Sekiro. One last note, although FromSoftware makes my favorite games, I actually enjoy all kinds of games. I started up a second channel called Royal Press Gaming, listed in the description, where I discuss other games. Check that out if you want. My first video is about the newest Ratchet & Clank game, Rift Apart, so if you're interested, feel free to give it a look. I hope everyone has a fantastic week and happy Independence Day to any Americans out there. Like I said, I might be streaming on this channel tomorrow, so if you see me here, feel free to stop by. Have a good one, guys. Peace.
Farewell, good hunter. May you find your worth in the waking world.